Gate agent denies black pilot's ID as fake, red-faced when captain's announcement begins. The first thing Captain Marcus Washington noticed when he approached the gate was the agent's dismissive glance. After 15 years of flying commercial aircraft, he recognized that look immediately. The subtle widening of eyes, the momentary hesitation, the quick assessment that didn't quite align with the uniform he wore or the pilot's credentials in his hand. What Captain Washington couldn't have known was that this seemingly routine interaction would spiral into a confrontation that would change multiple lives forever, expose the insidious nature of unconscious bias, and ultimately become a pivotal moment in his distinguished career. "Good morning," Marcus said, sliding his ID badge and flight credentials across the counter with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times. "Captain Washington checking in for Flight 1372 to Chicago." Amelia Barrett, the gate agent with 7 years at Transcontinental Airlines, barely glanced at the identification before her eyes snapped back up, scrutinizing his face with unconcealed suspicion. "This doesn't look right," she said, picking up the ID between 2 fingers as if it might be contaminated. "I'm going to need additional verification." Behind Marcus, First Officer Jennifer Chen watched with growing discomfort. She had been flying with Marcus for 3 years and had witnessed this scenario play out before, though never quite this blatantly. What neither of them realized was that this moment would set in motion a sequence of events that would expose deep-seated prejudices, unite strangers in unexpected ways, challenge a corporate culture, and ultimately force each person involved to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world they navigated every day. And it all began with those 5 dismissive words. "This doesn't look right," and a gatekeeping moment that would soon backfire spectacularly when the captain's announcement began. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he maintained his professional demeanor. "My credentials are in order, Ms. Barrett," he said, reading her name tag. "I've been a captain with Transcontinental for 11 years now." Amelia's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well, I haven't seen you before." She turned the ID over in her hands, holding it up to the light as if checking for a watermark. "These can be very convincingly faked these days." Jennifer stepped forward. "Excuse me, but Captain Washington is my commanding officer. We have a flight to prepare for." Amelia barely acknowledged Jennifer, her eyes fixed on Marcus. "Protocol requires me to verify any identification that appears suspicious." Her emphasis on the word, suspicious, hung in the air between them. Marcus had experienced this before, the unfounded suspicion, the extra scrutiny that his white colleagues rarely faced. He'd learned to pick his battles carefully, to respond with professionalism rather than justifiable anger. "Perhaps you could call your supervisor to verify my credentials," he suggested calmly. "That won't be necessary," came a voice from behind them. Richard Torres, the terminal operations manager, approached with a concerned expression. "What seems to be the problem here, Amelia?" "I'm just following protocol, sir. This ID doesn't match what our pilots usually carry." Amelia held up Marcus's credentials. Richard glanced at the ID, then at Marcus, recognition dawning immediately. "Captain Washington, good to see you again. I apologize for the delay." He turned to Amelia. "This is indeed our captain for Flight 1372. His credentials are perfectly valid." The color drained from Amelia's face as she realized her mistake, or rather, as she was forced to confront the assumption that had led to her suspicion in the first place. I was just being thorough," she stammered. "Perhaps too thorough," Richard replied quietly. "Captain, you're clear to proceed to the aircraft. Again, my apologies." As Marcus and Jennifer walked away, Marcus could feel the eyes of waiting passengers on him. Some had witnessed the exchange with expressions ranging from discomfort to outright embarrassment on Amelia's behalf. Others seemed oblivious, absorbed in their phones or books. "That happens too often," Jennifer muttered as they headed toward the jet bridge. "More often than you know," Marcus replied, his voice even. What neither of them realized was that among the witnesses was Sophia Walker, a travel journalist with a significant online following who had captured parts of the interaction on her phone. And in seat 4A sat Douglas Winters, a Transcontinental Airlines board member traveling incognito to evaluate customer service. Both would play unexpected roles in what was about to unfold. As Marcus and Jennifer boarded the aircraft, Marcus made a decision. This incident wouldn't just be another story he told his wife Diana when he got home, another example of the daily indignities he navigated in a profession where less than 3% of commercial pilots were black. Today, he would address it directly, professionally, but clearly. Marcus completed his pre-flight checks with the focused precision that had made him one of Transcontinental's most respected pilots. The cabin crew, Sofia Rodriguez, James Kim, and Natalie Ockhafer, sensed his tension but attributed it to the tight departure schedule they were now facing due to the delay at the gate. As passengers boarded, Marcus reviewed the flight plan once more, calculating fuel consumption against expected weather conditions. Jennifer handled the communications with ground crew, her efficiency giving Marcus space to process his thoughts. When boarding was complete and they were preparing for pushback, Marcus picked up the cabin announcement microphone. This was usually a routine moment, a brief welcome, some flight information, the standard reassurances about safety and comfort. But today, Marcus decided, would be different. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Marcus Washington speaking, and I'll be commanding Flight 1372 to Chicago O'Hare this morning. His deep voice resonated through the cabin. Our flying time today will be approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes. Weather in Chicago is partly cloudy with temperatures around 75 degrees. He paused, his next words carefully chosen. Before we depart, I'd like to thank those of you who were at Gate 14 for your patience during our slight delay. There was some confusion about my identification and credentials as your captain. As one of the few black airline captains you may encounter, I sometimes face additional scrutiny. However, I want to assure you that I have been flying with Transcontinental for 11 years, have over 18,000 hours of flight experience, and am fully qualified to get you safely to your destination. Through the cockpit window, Marcus could see Amelia Barrett standing at the gate counter, her face now flushed with embarrassment as passengers on board looked toward her through the windows, some with obvious disapproval. I share this with you not to make anyone uncomfortable, but because visibility matters, representation matters, and perhaps most importantly, addressing unconscious bias matters for all of us. Now, our first officer today is Jennifer Chen, an excellent pilot with 8 years of experience, and we're both looking forward to providing you with a smooth and pleasant journey to Chicago. As he set down the microphone, Marcus could hear a ripple of applause spreading through the cabin. Jennifer gave him a respectful nod. That took courage, she said quietly. Sometimes courage is necessary, he replied, turning his attention to the final preparations for takeoff. What Marcus couldn't see was the impact his words were having throughout the aircraft. In first class, Douglas Winters was already typing a message to the airline's CEO. In row 15, Sophia Walker was crafting a social media post that would soon go viral. And throughout the cabin, conversations were starting between strangers, about bias, about assumptions, about the unexpected courage of addressing uncomfortable truths directly and professionally. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, none of them, not Marcus, not Jennifer, not the embarrassed Amelia, nor any of the passengers, could have predicted how this single incident would cascade into a story that would touch countless lives, challenge ingrained perspectives, and ultimately lead to unexpected redemption and change. But it all began in this moment, as the engines rumbled to life and Flight 1372 began its journey, not just to Chicago, but into a complex exploration of human prejudice, courage, and the possibility of growth that exists even in our most flawed institutions and individuals. The reactions throughout the cabin were as varied as the passengers themselves. In Seat 7C, Elena Garcia, a university professor specializing in implicit bias training, had witnessed the entire gate incident. Marcus's announcement had brought tears to her eyes, not just because of the injustice he had faced, but because of the measured dignity with which he had addressed it. "Did you hear what he said?" she whispered to her seatmate, Michael Abernathy, a middle-aged investment banker who had been absorbed in spreadsheets on his tablet. Michael looked up, distracted. "Something about credentials." Elena took a breath, deciding whether this was a teaching moment worth pursuing. "Our captain was racially profiled at the gate. The agent didn't believe he was really a pilot because he's black." Michael's expression shifted from distraction to discomfort. Oh, well, I'm sure she was just being thorough, security and all that. Would she have questioned a white captain's ID with the same suspicion? Alina asked quietly. Michael shifted in his seat, the spreadsheets suddenly forgotten. Look, not everything is about race. Maybe she was new. Maybe she'd been warned about security breaches. 2 rows behind them, Jamal Robinson, a 17-year-old aspiring pilot traveling with his father, had heard both the announcement and this exchange. For years, he had dreamed of sitting in the captain's chair, of navigating massive aircraft through the skies. But he had also worried about the obstacles he might face, obstacles that had just been made painfully concrete by Captain Washington's experience. "Dad," he said, turning to his father, Kenneth Robinson, a high school principal. "That's exactly what you always talk about, the invisible barriers." Kenneth nodded solemnly. "And that's why what the captain just did is so important, son. He didn't let it slide. He named it respectfully but clearly." As the plane climbed through the clouds, the cabin crew began their service. Sofia Rodriguez, the chief flight attendant, had worked with Marcus many times before and had tremendous respect for him. As she pushed the beverage cart down the aisle, she overheard snippets of conversations. Many passengers were discussing the captain's announcement. In first class, Douglas Winters signaled to Sophia. "I'd like to speak with the captain when it's convenient," he said, keeping his voice low. "Not about his announcement. I thought that was handled with remarkable professionalism. It's another matter." Sophia nodded, though she was instantly protective. "I'll let him know when the flight deck is available for visitors, sir." Meanwhile, in row 22, Sophia Walker was already seeing her social media post gain traction. "Just witnessed disturbing racial profiling at Transcontinental Air Gate 14. Black airline captain had ID questioned as fake by gate agent who couldn't believe he was really a pilot. Captain Washington handled it with incredible dignity, even addressing it in his welcome announcement. Do better, Transcontinental. Flying while black, unconscious bias." Next to her sat Reverend Thomas Jackson, an elderly civil rights activist who had marched with Dr. King decades ago. He peered at her phone with interest. "You're making this incident visible," he said approvingly. "That matters." Sophia looked up in surprise. "It just seemed so wrong. I couldn't believe what I was seeing." Reverend Jackson smiled sadly. "I've seen it all my life, young lady. Different contexts, same story. But what gives me hope is that people are finally willing to name it when they see it. That's the first step toward change." As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Jennifer handled the controls while Marcus reviewed their route data. The cockpit door opened slightly as James Kim, one of the flight attendants, leaned in. "Captain, several passengers have asked to express their support after your announcement," he said. "And there's a gentleman in first class who's requested to speak with you when possible. Mr. Winters in 4A. Marcus nodded. "Thank you, James. Let's maintain protocol for cockpit visits, but I appreciate the update." After James left, Jennifer glanced at Marcus. "You've started something," she said. "I just stated facts," Marcus replied, adjusting a setting on the navigation display. "Facts matter," Jennifer said, "especially when they're usually swept under the rug." She hesitated, then added, "I've experienced my share of biases as an Asian female pilot, but I know it's different for you, more frequent, more presumptive." Marcus appreciated her acknowledgement. Too often, colleagues either ignored these incidents or overcompensated with awkward sympathy. Jennifer's straightforward recognition felt right. "My father wanted me to become a doctor," Marcus said with a slight smile. "Said I'd face less of this nonsense in medicine. He wasn't entirely wrong, but the skies were always where I belonged." "Medicine's loss was aviation's gain," Jennifer replied. "Though I doubt emergency surgeons have to deal with passengers asking if they're really qualified to remove an appendix because of their race." The dark humor landed perfectly, and they both chuckled, the tension of the morning briefly dissipating in their shared understanding. Back in the cabin, the incident had stirred memories for Benjamin Taylor in seat 12B, as a retired Air Force colonel who had served during the era when the military was first being integrated. He had seen the struggles of the Tuskegee Airmen and their successors firsthand. "Reminds me of Lieutenant Harris back in '72, he murmured to himself. Best damn pilot in the squadron, but always had to prove himself twice over. Linda Mercer, seated beside him, overheard his comment. My nephew is in flight school now, she said. He's black and brilliant. Breaking barriers seems like it should be a thing of the past, doesn't it? Benjamin turned to her with a weathered smile. Should be, ma'am, should be. Near the back of the aircraft, Amara Wilson, a corporate diversity consultant returning from a client engagement, was using the incident as an impromptu teaching moment with her seatmate, Brian Cooper, a college student. This is exactly why representation matters in visible leadership positions, she explained. When we don't see black pilots frequently, it becomes easier for people to question their legitimacy. Brian nodded thoughtfully. I guess I've never really noticed the race of pilots before. They're just pilots. That's privilege, Amara said gently. Not having to notice is a luxury some don't have. The conversations continued throughout the aircraft. Some uncomfortable, some enlightening, all necessary. What had begun as a biased assumption by one gate agent was transforming into hundreds of discussions about race, assumptions, professional dignity, and the courage to address uncomfortable truths. In the cockpit, Marcus was focused on flying the aircraft, unaware that his decision to speak up had created a catalyst for exactly the kind of meaningful dialogue that drives genuine change. The human connections forming below would prove more powerful than any corporate diversity training or public relations statement. And as Flight 1372 soared toward Chicago, the story was already spreading far beyond the confines of the aircraft, taking on dimensions that would soon force Transcontinental Airlines and Amelia Barrett to confront some uncomfortable truths of their own. 2 hours into the flight, Sophia Walker's social media post had accumulated over 50,000 shares. The hashtag #flying while black was trending, with others sharing similar experiences across various airlines. Transcontinental's public relations team had already issued a hurried statement promising to investigate the incident and take appropriate action. In the corporate headquarters in Atlanta, CEO Victoria Hargrove was in an emergency meeting with her executive team. The viral post had caught them flat-footed, and investors were already expressing concern about potential damage to the brand. Get me everything we have on this Captain Washington, Victoria instructed her chief of staff, and I want to speak with him personally once he lands. What Victoria didn't yet know was that Douglas Winters, sitting quietly in seat 4A, had already sent her a direct message that would significantly impact her approach to the situation. Victoria, I'm on Flight 1372 and witnessed the incident with Captain Washington. Before you craft your corporate response, you should know he handled himself with exemplary professionalism. This isn't a PR problem to manage. It's an opportunity to address a real issue in our company culture. Call me when I land, Doug. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, the initial shock of the captain's announcement had evolved into deeper conversations. Elena Garcia, the university professor, had abandoned any pretense of working and was engaged in thoughtful dialogue with her seatmate Michael, who had moved from defensive dismissal to reluctant engagement. I'm not saying everyone is deliberately racist, Elena explained patiently. I'm saying we all carry unconscious biases based on what society has programmed into us. The gate agent probably doesn't consider herself prejudiced, but her immediate assumption reveals internalized stereotypes about who looks like a pilot. Michael frowned, but if it's unconscious, how are people supposed to change it? By first acknowledging it exists, Elena replied. Which is exactly what Captain Washington did today. He named it without accusation or anger. That's the first step. Several rows away, Jamal Robinson was receiving an unexpected mentorship opportunity. After mentioning his aspirations to become a pilot to flight attendant James Kim, James had quietly arranged for a message to be passed to the cockpit. Now, Jamal had been invited to briefly visit the flight deck during cruise, a rare opportunity that had him practically vibrating with excitement. Remember, son, his father advised as Jamal prepared to follow James to the cockpit. This is a professional courtesy. Be respectful of their time and space. Jamal nodded earnestly. I will, Dad. I have so many questions. When the cockpit door opened, Jamal found himself face to face with Captain Washington, who had temporarily handed control to Jennifer to greet the young visitor. "Mr. Robinson, welcome to the flight deck," Marcus said warmly, extending his hand. "James tells me you're interested in aviation." Jamal's nervousness dissolved in his excitement. "Yes, sir. I've been studying for my private pilot's license already. I hope to start commercial training after college." For the next few minutes, Marcus and Jennifer answered Jamal's questions about flight paths, instrumentation, and training requirements. As James signaled that it was time for Jamal to return to his seat, the young man hesitated. "Captain Washington," he said, his voice suddenly smaller, "after what happened at the gate, do you ever regret becoming a pilot?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Marcus considered his response carefully. "Not for a single day," he finally said, his voice firm. "The sky doesn't care about the color of your skin, Jamal. There will be people who question your right to be in that captain's seat, but every time you prove them wrong by your excellence, you make it easier for those who come after you. That's worth every difficult moment." Jamal's face broke into a wide smile. "Thank you, sir. I won't forget this." As James escorted Jamal back to his seat, Marcus checked his watch. They would be beginning their descent into Chicago O'Hare within 30 minutes. What he didn't know was that events on the ground were accelerating rapidly. At O'Hare, a small contingent of transcontinental employees had gathered at the arrival gate. News of the incident had spread through employee channels, and a spontaneous show of solidarity was building. Among them was Daniel Okonkwo, another black captain who had experienced similar treatment throughout his career. "This stops today," Daniel told the group. "Not with anger, not with accusations, but with visibility and truth. When Marcus walks off that plane, I want him to see that he's not alone." In the terminal, local news crews had already gathered, alerted by the viral social media activity. What had begun as a personal indignity was rapidly transforming into a public conversation about racial bias in the airline industry and beyond. Back on the aircraft, as the seatbelt signs illuminated for descent, Marcus made his final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Local time is 11:42 a.m. and the temperature is 77 degrees. We'll be landing in approximately 20 minutes." He paused, then added, "I want to thank you all for your professionalism and support during this flight. It's been my privilege to be your captain today. Before we land, I'd like to ask a favor. If this morning's incident and our subsequent conversation about bias has meant something to you, consider continuing the dialogue beyond this flight. Real change happens when we're brave enough to have uncomfortable conversations with respect and openness." As he set down the microphone, Marcus didn't know about the gathering at the gate, the news crews, or the corporate crisis meeting in progress. He was simply doing what he had always done, flying with excellence while navigating the additional burdens placed upon him by a society still struggling with its prejudices. "Nice touch," Jennifer commented as she adjusted the flaps for descent. "Just speaking truth," Marcus replied, his focus returning to the technical precision of bringing the aircraft safely to the ground. Below them, Chicago sprawled into the distance, its skyline piercing through the morning haze. And waiting in that city was the unexpected next chapter in a story that had begun with 5 dismissive words from a gate agent, but would ultimately touch far more lives than anyone on Flight 1372 could possibly imagine. The aircraft touched down at O'Hare with the smoothness that was Captain Washington's signature. As they taxied toward the gate, Marcus and Jennifer completed their post-landing checklist with practiced efficiency, unaware of what awaited them. "Captain," James Kim said, appearing at the cockpit door, "there's something you should know before we reach the gate." Marcus looked up, momentarily concerned. "Problem with a passenger?" "No, sir, theirs. Well, there's a bit of a reception waiting for you. News crews, airline staff, your arrival has become something of an event." Marcus and Jennifer exchanged surprised glances. "How did this happen so quickly?" Jennifer asked. James held up his phone, showing Sophia Walker's viral post, now with over 200,000 shares and growing. "Social media moves fast, Captain." Marcus took a deep breath, the weight of unexpected public attention settling on his shoulders. Throughout his career, he had been careful to navigate racial issues with professionalism and restraint. He had no desire to become the face of a movement or a corporate scandal. "Thank you for the heads up, James," he said evenly. "Let's proceed normally and handle this with dignity." As the aircraft pulled into the gate, Marcus could see through the cockpit windows what James had described. A cluster of uniformed transcontinental pilots and flight attendants waiting in the jetway, news cameras positioned in the terminal beyond. He completed the shutdown procedures methodically, buying himself moments to think. Jennifer watched him with concern. "You don't have to be the spokesperson for this, Marcus. You can decline to comment." Marcus nodded. "I know, but sometimes the moment chooses you, not the other way around." He adjusted his uniform and cap. "Let's go." When the cockpit door opened and Marcus emerged into the cabin, he was met with spontaneous applause from the passengers, something almost unheard of on a routine domestic flight. As he made his way toward the exit, passengers reached out to shake his hand or simply nod in respect. Reverend Jackson, the elderly civil rights activist, caught his arm gently. "Well done, son," he said quietly. "Well done." Marcus thanked him with a nod, continuing toward the aircraft door where James stood ready to open it. "Ready, Captain?" James asked. "As I'll ever be," Marcus replied. The door opened, and Marcus stepped into the jetway to find himself facing a line of transcontinental pilots and flight attendants, standing at attention in a show of solidarity. At their forefront stood Captain Daniel Okonkwo, an old friend from flight school. "Marcus," Daniel said formally, extending his hand. "We heard what happened. We stand with you." The simple gesture, colleagues publicly acknowledging the reality of what he had experienced, nearly broke through Marcus's professional composure. He grasped Daniel's hand firmly, emotion briefly tightening his throat. "Thank you," he managed, looking down the line of faces. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, all united in this moment of professional solidarity. As they moved into the terminal, the waiting media surged forward, cameras and microphones extended. A local news reporter stepped directly into Marcus's path. "Captain Washington, can you tell us about the racial profiling incident you experienced this morning?" Before Marcus could respond, another voice cut through the chaos. "Captain Washington will be making no statements at this time." Marcus turned to see a woman in a sharp business suit pushing through the crowd. "Victoria Hargrove, CEO of Transcontinental Airlines," she said, extending her hand to Marcus. "I'd like to speak with you privately, Captain, if you're willing." The reporters immediately redirected their questions to Victoria, who raised a hand to silence them. "Transcontinental takes this incident extremely seriously. We will be issuing a comprehensive statement after I've had the opportunity to speak with Captain Washington and conduct a thorough investigation. What I can say now is that discrimination of any kind has no place in our company." She turned to Marcus. "My office is available, Captain, if you have time." Marcus nodded, recognizing the mixture of corporate damage control and genuine concern in her approach. "I need to complete my post-flight duties first, but yes, I can make time." As the media continued shouting questions, Douglas Winters appeared from the first-class exit, quickly assessing the situation. He approached Victoria discreetly. "Victoria, a word," he said quietly. Recognition flashed across her face. "Doug, I didn't realize you were on this flight." "Intentionally," he replied. "Monthly customer experience audit, but that's not important now. What matters is how we handle this moment. It's not just a PR issue, it's a cultural one." Victoria nodded, her expression serious. "I'm aware, that's why I'm here personally." Meanwhile, Jennifer had emerged from the aircraft and joined Marcus, standing supportively at his side as they navigated the unexpected attention. Behind them, Jamal Robinson and his father watched with wide eyes, the young aspiring pilot witnessing firsthand both the challenges and the solidarity within the profession he hoped to join. "Dad," Jamal whispered, "I still want to be a pilot more than ever now." Kenneth squeezed his son's shoulder proudly. "And you will be, son, you will be." As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus found himself face to face with Sophia Walker, the travel journalist whose post had catalyzed this moment. "Captain Washington," she said, "I hope I didn't overstep by sharing what happened. It just seemed so wrong and people needed to see it." Marcus studied her for a moment. Visibility matters, Ms. Walker. Sometimes it takes an outside voice to amplify what those of us inside systems have been saying for years. Sophia nodded gratefully. Would you be willing to share more of your story? Not just about today, but about your journey as a black pilot. People are listening now. The request gave Marcus pause. He had always kept his head down, focusing on excellence rather than activism. But perhaps that approach, while personally protective, had allowed too many systemic issues to persist unchallenged. Let me think about it, he said finally. Today has been unexpected. As the terminal returned to its normal rhythm, Marcus found himself in a moment of quiet reflection. What had begun as a routine flight had transformed into something far more significant, not just for him, but potentially for countless others who faced similar barriers. The question now was what to do with this unexpected platform, and how to ensure that today's visibility translated into meaningful change, rather than just another viral moment soon forgotten in the relentless churn of the news cycle. That question would lead him to decisions he never anticipated making, alliances he never expected to form, and ultimately to a reckoning that would reach far beyond one gate agent's biased assumption about who could be trusted in a pilot's uniform. Victoria Hargrove's temporary office at O'Hare was a stark contrast to her expansive headquarters suite in Atlanta, a converted conference room with hastily arranged furniture and the lingering smell of the previous occupant's coffee. Yet it served its purpose as she sat across from Marcus, Jennifer, and Douglas Winters, the unexpected gravity of their meeting belying the room's mundane appearance. First, Captain Washington, I want to personally apologize for what happened this morning, Victoria began, her usual corporate polish tempered by what appeared to be genuine regret. It was unacceptable, and it does not reflect the values we aspire to at Transcontinental. Marcus nodded acknowledgement, neither accepting nor dismissing the apology. I appreciate you taking this seriously, Ms. Hargrove. Victoria, please, she leaned forward. I'd like to understand from your perspective exactly what transpired. For the next several minutes, Marcus recounted the incident. Amelia Barrett's immediate suspicion, her scrutiny of his ID, her implication that it might be fake, and the intervention by terminal manager Richard Torres. He spoke factually without emotional embellishment, yet the details themselves painted a clear picture of bias. Jennifer occasionally added her observations, providing additional context about how unusual the level of scrutiny had been compared to their normal experiences at Gates. Douglas Winters listened intently, his expression grave. As a board member who had championed diversity initiatives within the company, often against resistance, he recognized the incident as symptomatic of deeper issues. This isn't isolated, is it, Marcus? Douglas asked when the captain finished his account. In your experience. Marcus met his gaze directly. No, Mr. Winters, it isn't. Less overt, usually. A second glance at credentials, security personnel following me on the tarmac, passengers expressing surprise when they see me in the cockpit, small things individually, exhausting collectively. Victoria made notes, her corporate training at war with her personal discomfort. What would you like to see happen here, Captain? Disciplinary action for Ms. Barrett? A formal apology? The question hung in the air as Marcus considered it carefully. Punitive action against Amelia might satisfy some immediate call for justice, but would it address the underlying issues? Ms. Hargrove, Victoria, he said finally, firing Amelia Barrett might feel like resolution, but it would be treating a symptom while ignoring the disease. What happened today wasn't just about one gate agent's bias. It's about a culture that makes her assumptions seem reasonable to her. Victoria raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his approach. You're not calling for her termination. I'm calling for something more difficult, Marcus replied. Systemic change, meaningful diversity training, not just compliance checkboxes, recruitment initiatives targeting underrepresented groups in aviation, mentorship programs, and yes, accountability for Ms. Barrett, but accountability that leads to growth, not just punishment. Douglas nodded approvingly. He's right, Victoria. We've been talking about these initiatives at the board level for years. This incident gives us the impetus to actually implement them. Jennifer, who had been quietly observing, added her perspective. As an Asian woman in the cockpit, I face different but related challenges. Captain Washington's suggestions would benefit all underrepresented groups in aviation. Victoria tapped her pen thoughtfully against her notepad. This is more comprehensive than I expected, Captain. I thought you might want a quick resolution and to put this behind you. Marcus smiled slightly. With respect, Victoria, I've been putting these incidents behind me for my entire career. Perhaps it's time we all face them head-on instead. Before Victoria could respond, there was a knock at the door. Her assistant entered with a tablet. Sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this immediately. Victoria took the tablet, her expression shifting as she scanned the screen. The incident is gaining national attention. Major news networks are picking it up, and... She paused, scrolling further. There's a hashtag campaign calling for a boycott of Transcontinental unless we take substantive action. She handed the tablet to Douglas, who reviewed it with a grimace. The court of public opinion moves faster than corporate decision-making processes. We need to get ahead of this. Marcus watched their reaction with mixed emotions. Public pressure might accelerate change, but it also risked simplifying a complex issue into trending hashtags and viral outrage. Real transformation required more than public relations statements and quick fixes. If I may, he said carefully, this attention creates an opportunity for Transcontinental to lead rather than just react. Instead of a defensive response, what about using this moment to launch initiatives you've already been considering? Position the company as taking this incident seriously enough to catalyze meaningful systemic improvements. Victoria studied him with newfound respect. That's actually quite brilliant from a PR perspective. It transforms a potential crisis into a platform for positive change. It's not just PR, Marcus emphasized. These changes need to be real and substantial. Of course, Victoria agreed quickly, perhaps too quickly. Douglas, sensing the potential for corporate window dressing, intervened. I believe what Captain Washington is suggesting deserves board-level support. With your permission, Victoria, I'd like to propose an executive task force led by Captain Washington himself, reporting directly to the board, with a mandate to implement concrete diversity and inclusion initiatives across our operations. Victoria hesitated, clearly calculating the implications of ceding this much authority to an employee who had just been thrust into the spotlight. That's unusual, she said carefully. So is the situation, Douglas replied. And frankly, having someone with Captain Washington's first-hand experience leading these efforts gives them credibility that a standard corporate response would lack. Jennifer watched this exchange with growing hope. For years, she and Marcus had discussed these issues privately, feeling powerless to effect company-wide change from their positions as line pilots. Now, suddenly, there was an opening, unexpected, unplanned, but potentially transformative. If I may, Jennifer interjected, I believe Captain Washington's response to this incident demonstrates precisely why he would be ideal to lead such an initiative. He's approached this with professionalism and a focus on constructive improvement rather than personal grievance or punitive measures. Victoria looked from Douglas to Marcus to Jennifer, recognizing that the dynamic in the room had shifted. This was no longer just about damage control for a PR crisis. It was about a potential inflection point for the company's culture. After a long moment, she nodded decisively. All right, Captain Washington, are you willing to take on this role? It would require temporary reassignment from regular flight duties, with full compensation, of course. The question caught Marcus by surprise. He had come to this meeting expecting a standard corporate apology, perhaps some disciplinary action against Amelia, and a return to business as usual. Now he was being offered a platform to actually implement the changes he had advocated for years. I would need to discuss this with my wife, he said thoughtfully. It's a significant shift from my current responsibilities. Of course, Victoria replied, but we need to move quickly. The public statement needs to go out within hours, not days. Marcus nodded, understanding the time pressure. I'll give you my answer by the end of the day. As the meeting concluded and they prepared to leave, Douglas held back to speak with Marcus privately. This wasn't what I expected when I boarded a routine flight this morning, he said with a wry smile. That makes two of us, Marcus replied. Douglas's expression turned serious. If you take this on, you'll face resistance, not just from the usual suspects who dismiss diversity initiatives as political correctness, but also from those who benefit from the status quo, sometimes without even realizing it. I'm aware, Marcus said. I've been navigating those currents my entire career. Yes, but as a pilot, you could eventually retreat to the cockpit, a space where your competence speaks for itself. This role would put you squarely in the crosshairs of corporate politics. Douglas paused. I'm not trying to discourage you, quite the opposite. I think you're exactly what Transcontinental needs right now. I just want you to be prepared for what you'd be stepping into. Marcus appreciated the candor. Thank you for the perspective and for your support in there. As they parted ways, Marcus found himself at a crossroads, both literally standing in the terminal junction and figuratively facing a decision that could alter the trajectory of his career and potentially impact countless others in the industry. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, Diana. Just saw the news. Are you okay? Call me when you can. Attached was a link to a national news website where the incident was now the featured story. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of unexpected visibility. He had always been careful to separate his professional identity from activism, focusing on excellence in the cockpit while navigating bias with quiet dignity. Now that separation was collapsing, thrust into public view by a single incident that had resonated far beyond what he could have anticipated. The question wasn't just whether to accept Victoria's offer, but whether he was ready to step into a role that would fundamentally change how colleagues, passengers, and the public viewed him. No longer just Captain Washington the pilot, but Marcus Washington the advocate, the symbol, the change agent. As he dialed Diana's number, he knew their conversation would help clarify the path forward. But he also knew that something had already shifted irrevocably, not just for him, but for everyone who had been on Flight 1372 that morning. Diana Washington was not easily rattled. As an emergency room physician, she had developed a calm efficiency in crisis that served her well in both her professional and personal life. But seeing her husband's name trending on social media and his face on national news had momentarily shaken her composure. When her phone rang with Marcus's call, she answered immediately, stepping away from the busy hospital corridor into a quiet consultation room. "Marcus," she said, relief evident in her voice, "are you all right?" "I'm fine," he assured her. "It's been an unexpected day, to say the least." Diana laughed softly. "That's an understatement. Your face is all over CNN right now. Our daughter called from college asking why her dad is suddenly famous." Marcus smiled at the mention of Zoe, their 19-year-old daughter studying aerospace engineering at MIT, following in her father's footsteps, but charting her own path towards spacecraft rather than aircraft. "Listen, Diana, something's happened beyond just the incident going viral. I've been offered a position to lead diversity initiatives at Transcontinental, reporting directly to the board." He explained the meeting with Victoria and Douglas, the proposed task force, and the unexpected opportunity to implement changes he'd long advocated for privately. Diana listened intently, understanding the magnitude of the decision before him. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You know this would put a target on your back," she said finally. "Corporate America doesn't always embrace change agents, even when they publicly claim to want diversity." "I know," Marcus acknowledged. "Douglas Winters made that point as well." "But," Diana continued, her voice softening, "this is also what you've been talking about for years over dinner. The changes that could make a real difference for people like Zoe entering the industry, for that young man you mentioned who visited the cockpit today." Marcus leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of the decision. "It would mean stepping away from flying, at least temporarily. You know how much I love being in the air." "I do," Diana said, "but I also know you love justice, and this is a rare opportunity to create it on a systemic level." She paused. "Whatever you decide, I support you completely, but Marcus, I think you already know what your answer is going to be." He smiled, recognizing the truth in her words. Diana had always been able to read him, even when he was still sorting through his own thoughts. "I'll need to be in Atlanta more," he said, the decision crystallizing as he spoke, "at least initially." "We've handled worse separations," Diana reminded him. Remember your military deployments? Besides, Atlanta's not that far from Chicago. We'll make it work." After a few more minutes discussing logistics and agreeing to talk again that evening, Marcus ended the call with renewed clarity. Diana was right. He had already known what his answer would be from the moment Victoria made the offer. His hesitation had been about the personal costs, not the decision itself. As he walked back toward the airline operations center, he passed a television in the terminal lounge displaying news coverage of the incident. The chyron read, "Racial profiling at major airline. Black pilot's credentials questioned." The screen showed a photo of him in his captain's uniform, looking authoritative and professional, an image that contradicted the very assumptions that had led to the gate incident. Beside it was a still image captured from a passenger's phone video showing Amelia Barrett holding his ID with visible skepticism. Marcus paused, watching the coverage with an odd sense of detachment. The narrative being constructed in the media was simultaneously accurate and incomplete, capturing the facts of what had occurred, but missing the complex human dimensions that existed beneath the surface. Amelia Barrett was being portrayed as a villain, a racist gate agent who had deliberately humiliated a black pilot. But Marcus had seen something more nuanced in her expression, not deliberate malice but unconscious bias, the kind that operates below the level of awareness until confronted directly. His phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer, "Media requesting interviews with both of us. What's your take?" Marcus considered the question carefully. Engaging with the media would amplify his platform, but could also sensationalize the issue in ways that might undermine meaningful change. Declining would maintain his professional distance, but might miss an opportunity to shape the narrative constructively. Before he could respond, another message arrived, this one from Richard Torres, the terminal manager who had intervened at the gate. "Captain Washington, Amelia Barrett has requested to speak with you if you're willing. She's devastated by what happened." That request surprised Marcus. He had expected Amelia to avoid him, to retreat into defensive silence or corporate-approved statements. Her desire to speak directly suggested something more complex than the one-dimensional villain being portrayed in the media. As he considered these converging requests, Marcus recognized that the path forward wasn't just about his new role at the corporate level. It was also about how he engaged with the immediate human dimensions of what had occurred. The decision to accept Victoria's offer had been relatively straightforward once he'd processed it. These next decisions, about media engagement and whether to meet with Amelia, were more nuanced, touching on questions of justice, redemption, and how change actually occurs in human systems. Marcus texted Jennifer back, "Let's hold off on interviews for now. I want actions to speak before words." Then he responded to Richard, "I'm willing to meet with Ms. Barrett this afternoon if possible." As he continued toward the operations center to formally accept Victoria's offer, Marcus reflected on how quickly life could pivot on seemingly small moments. 24 hours ago, he had been preparing for a routine flight to Chicago, focused on weather patterns and fuel calculations. Now he was stepping into a role that might help reshape an industry's approach to diversity and inclusion. The weight of that responsibility settled on him, not as a burden but as a purpose. For years, he had navigated the skies with precision and care. Now he was being called to navigate something perhaps even more complex: human attitudes, corporate systems, and the delicate process of cultural change. It was terrain he hadn't been trained for in flight school. But as Diana had intuited, it was territory he had been preparing to enter his entire career. Through every biased interaction he had handled with dignity, every subtle barrier he had overcome with excellence, every young person of color he had inspired simply by occupying a seat traditionally denied to people who looked like him. He reached for his phone again, sending a final text to Victoria Hargrove. "I accept the position. Let's meet tomorrow to discuss implementation." The decision made, Marcus felt an unexpected sense of calm. Whatever turbulence lay ahead, and he had no illusions that this journey would be smooth, he had his bearings now. The course was set. Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying this story so far. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know what part of the world you're tuning in from. Now, let's get back to Captain Washington's journey. The conference room where Marcus waited for Amelia Barrett was deliberately neutral territory. Neither airline operations space nor public terminal, but a quiet administrative area where their conversation could occur without an audience or interruptions. He had arrived early, using the time to collect his thoughts and center himself for what would likely be a difficult interaction. When the door opened, Richard Torres entered first, his expression a mixture of professional concern and personal discomfort. Behind him came Amelia Barrett, her earlier confidence replaced by visible anxiety. Her eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting recent tears, and she clutched a tissue in one hand. "Captain Washington," Richard began formally, "thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Ms. Barrett has requested this opportunity to speak with you directly." Marcus nodded, gesturing to the chairs across the table. "Please sit down." Richard hesitated. "Would you prefer I stay, or would you like to speak privately?" Marcus looked to Amelia, leaving the choice to her. "Privately, if that's acceptable," she said, her voice smaller than it had been at the gate that morning. After Richard departed, a heavy silence filled the room. Amelia seemed unable to meet Marcus's gaze, focusing instead on the tissue twisted between her fingers. "Ms. Barrett," Marcus said finally, his tone neutral but not cold, "you wanted to speak with me." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize, Captain Washington. My behavior this morning was, I have no excuse. I'm deeply ashamed." Marcus studied her, noting the genuine distress in her posture and expression. "May I ask you something, Ms. Barrett?" "Of course," she replied quickly. "When you looked at my ID this morning, what was your first thought? Not what you said, but what you thought." The question clearly caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, closed it, then looked down at her hands. "The truth, please," Marcus said quietly. "This isn't about punishing you. I'm trying to understand something important." Amelia nodded, gathering her courage. "My first thought was that something didn't match. The ID showed a captain, but—" She trailed off, the unspoken bias hanging in the air between them. "But I didn't look like your mental image of a captain," Marcus finished for her. "Yes," she admitted, the word barely audible. "I've never thought of myself as prejudiced. My brother-in-law is black. I have friends from different backgrounds, but in that moment I just reacted. It wasn't conscious." Marcus nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting her explanation. "That's what makes unconscious bias so insidious, Ms. Barrett. It operates below our awareness, informing our gut reactions before our conscious mind has a chance to intervene." "I've been seeing a therapist," Amelia said unexpectedly. "For anxiety, she talks about how our brains make snap judgments based on patterns we've internalized. I just never thought." She looked up at Marcus directly for the first time. "I never thought I was carrying those kinds of patterns." The vulnerability in her admission shifted something in the conversation. This wasn't the defensive denial Marcus had encountered so often when confronting bias, the immediate retreat to "I don't see color" or "some of my best friends are black." This was something rarer, a genuine reckoning with uncomfortable self-knowledge. "Few people do," Marcus said, his tone softening slightly. "We all absorb messages from media, from cultural narratives, from the patterns of representation we see around us. When less than 3% of commercial pilots are black, and even fewer are in command positions, that creates a cognitive template that can override rational thought in split-second reactions." Amelia wiped at a tear. "That doesn't excuse what I did." "No," Marcus agreed. "It doesn't, but understanding the mechanism matters if you want to change the pattern." She nodded, something like hope flickering across her features. "The company is suspending me pending investigation. Everyone's saying I'll be fired. And I understand why. What I did was wrong. But I wanted you to know that I'm truly sorry and that I'm trying to understand why I acted that way." Marcus considered her words carefully, weighing justice against mercy, accountability against growth potential. In his new role, he would be helping shape how Transcontinental handled exactly these kinds of situations. "Ms. Barrett, what would you do differently if you could revisit this morning?" The question seemed to surprise her. Well, obviously I would have treated your ID like any other pilot's, but beyond that," she paused, thinking seriously about the question. "I would want to examine why my first instinct was suspicion. I would want to be more conscious of checking my assumptions." Marcus nodded. That's a start, but let me suggest something more specific. When you noticed that initial reaction, that sense that something didn't match, that was actually your opportunity. That feeling itself isn't the problem, it's what you do next that matters. Do you question your own assumption, or do you question the person in front of you? Understanding dawned in Amelia's expression. I questioned you instead of questioning myself. Exactly, Marcus said. And that's the pivotal moment where bias either perpetuates itself or begins to dissolve. Amelia absorbed this, nodding slowly. I've never thought about it that way. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Ms. Barrett, I can't tell you what will happen with your employment. That's not my decision to make. But I can tell you that whatever the outcome, this incident doesn't have to define you. It can be a painful end, or it can be a difficult beginning. A beginning of what? She asked quietly. Of a different way of moving through the world, Marcus replied. Of examining those automatic reactions and asking yourself where they come from. Of becoming conscious of patterns you've absorbed without choosing to. He paused, then added, the work I'll be doing with Transcontinental isn't just about punishing instances of bias. It's about creating systems and cultures where people learn to recognize and interrupt their own biased patterns before they harm others. Amelia looked at him with something like wonder. After what I did, you're sitting here essentially offering me guidance. I don't understand. Marcus smiled slightly. I've been on the receiving end of bias for my entire life, Ms. Barrett. If I believed people couldn't change, I'd have given up hope long ago. The question is whether you're willing to do the work that change requires. I am, she said with unexpected firmness. Whether they fire me or not, I need to understand this better, for myself. Marcus nodded, making a decision. I'll be speaking with Ms. Hargrove tomorrow about launching several initiatives. One of them will be comprehensive bias training for customer-facing staff. If you're retained, I'd like you to be among the first participants, and eventually, perhaps, to share your experience with others. Amelia's eyes widened. You would want me involved after what happened. Sometimes the most powerful advocates for change are people who have confronted their own biases directly, Marcus replied. Your experience this morning, painful as it was for both of us, could become valuable if you're willing to share it honestly with colleagues. For the first time, Amelia's posture relaxed slightly, the crushing weight of shame partially lifted by the possibility of redemption, not through denial or minimization, but through genuine growth and contribution. Thank you, Captain Washington, she said quietly. I don't deserve your generosity. Marcus stood, indicating that their conversation was concluding. This isn't about what any of us deserve, Ms. Barrett. It's about what creates meaningful change. Punishment might satisfy a desire for justice, but it rarely leads to transformation. I'm more interested in the latter. As they prepared to leave, Amelia hesitated at the door. May I ask you something personal, Captain? Marcus nodded cautiously. How do you not become bitter, facing this kind of thing repeatedly throughout your career? The question was sincere, and Marcus gave it the consideration it deserved. I have moments of anger, Ms. Barrett. I have days when the cumulative weight of these experiences feels overwhelming. But bitterness is a luxury I can't afford. Not if I want to continue doing what I love, not if I want to create space for those coming after me. He paused. And not if I want to retain my full humanity. Bitterness corrodes from within. Amelia nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for your honesty, and again, I'm truly sorry. As she left, Marcus remained in the conference room, reflecting on their exchange. The conversation had been unexpectedly productive, not because it had erased the harm of the morning's incident, but because it had potentially transformed it from a terminal event into a catalyst for genuine change, both individual and systemic. His phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. How did it go with Barrett? Better than expected, he replied. I'll fill you in later. Another text arrived, this one from Diana. Zoe's being interviewed by campus newspaper about you becoming a symbol of resistance against systemic bias in aviation. Your daughter's quite proud of her suddenly famous dad. Marcus smiled, imagining Zoe's passionate articulation of the issues. She had always been fiercely justice-oriented, challenging him sometimes on whether his professional restraint was actually enabling broken systems. Perhaps she had been right all along. Perhaps his approach, focusing on excellence while navigating bias with dignified restraint, had been necessary for his individual success but insufficient for systemic change. Perhaps this unexpected platform was offering him the opportunity to bridge that gap, to transform personal resilience into collective progress. As he gathered his belongings to leave, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with a simple gate check in that morning. What had started as an all-too-familiar experience of bias had evolved into something entirely unexpected, a potential inflection point not just in his own career, but in how an entire industry approached issues of diversity and inclusion. The path ahead would not be easy. Corporate initiatives often began with passionate commitment only to dissolve into performative gestures when attention shifted elsewhere. Marcus had no illusions about the challenges he would face in translating this moment of visibility into lasting change. But for the first time in his career, he had a platform from which to address these issues directly, with the backing of board-level support and public attention. It was an opportunity he had never sought, but now recognized as perhaps the most important flight plan he had ever been asked to navigate, one whose course would affect far more lives than any single journey across the skies. As he stepped out of the conference room, Marcus straightened his uniform out of habit. The physical embodiment of the professional excellence he had always used as his first line of defense against bias and doubt. But now that excellence would serve a broader purpose, creating not just individual achievement but collective transformation. The next phase of the journey was about to begin, and despite the turbulence that surely lay ahead, Captain Marcus Washington was ready to take the controls. In the months that followed, the incident at Gate 14 catalyzed changes that rippled outward from transcontinental airlines into the broader aviation industry and beyond. What might have been a momentary viral outrage, soon forgotten in the relentless news cycle, instead became a sustained movement for transformation, largely due to the thoughtful, strategic approach Marcus brought to his new role. 8 weeks after the incident, Marcus stood at a podium in Transcontinental's Atlanta headquarters, addressing a room filled with executives, diversity consultants, pilot representatives, and media. Behind him, a screen displayed the company's newly launched Elevate initiative, a comprehensive program designed to address bias at every level of the organization while simultaneously creating pathways for underrepresented groups to enter and advance within aviation. Today marks not an endpoint but a beginning, Marcus told the assembled group. The real measure of success won't be today's announcement or the headlines it generates, but the sustainable changes we create in our corporate culture, our hiring practices, our training protocols, and ultimately the lived experiences of both our employees and our passengers. In the front row, Victoria Hargrove nodded approvingly. What had begun as a PR crisis for her to manage had evolved into a genuine corporate evolution that was actually enhancing Transcontinental's brand and competitive position. Applications to the company's flight training program had increased by 64%, with particular growth among women and people of color. Employee satisfaction metrics were trending upward. And perhaps most importantly to Victoria's executive perspective, the initiative was generating positive attention from investors focused on corporate social responsibility. Beside her sat Douglas Winters, whose early support had been crucial in giving Marcus the authority and resources needed to implement meaningful change rather than cosmetic fixes. His gamble on elevating a line pilot to an executive role had paid off beyond his expectations. From the podium, Marcus continued, "I'm particularly proud to announce that our first cohort of the Transcontinental Flight Academy Scholarship Program includes 24 students from underrepresented backgrounds who will receive full financial support through their training and guaranteed first officer positions upon successful completion of the program." The announcement drew applause, particularly from a group seated near the back, the newly formed Diversity Advisory Council that included pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, and other frontline employees from across the company's operations. Among them sat Amelia Barrett, whose employment had ultimately been preserved through a probationary program that included intensive bias training and regular counseling sessions. Her willingness to speak openly about her experience, both the incident itself and her subsequent journey of self-examination, had made her an unexpected asset in the company's training programs. What might have ended her career had instead transformed it, redirecting her path toward educating colleagues about recognizing and interrupting their own biased patterns. As the presentation concluded and the reception began, Marcus found himself approached by Jamal Robinson, the young aspiring pilot from Flight 1372, now enrolled as one of the scholarship recipients in the Flight Academy program. "Captain Washington," Jamal said with barely contained excitement, "I just wanted to thank you again. I wouldn't be here without what happened that day." Marcus smiled, genuinely pleased to see the young man's dream taking concrete form. "You'd have found your way eventually, Jamal. You have the passion and the aptitude." "Maybe," Jamal acknowledged. "But it might have taken years longer, and honestly, I might have given up when facing the financial barriers. This scholarship changes everything for me, and for my dad, who was ready to take a second mortgage on our house to help pay for my training." Marcus nodded, understanding the economic dimensions of aviation's diversity challenges all too well. His own path had been made possible only through military service, one of the few routes available to aspiring pilots without substantial financial resources. "Just remember," Marcus said, "when you're sitting in that captain's seat someday, it'll be your turn to ensure the door stays open for those coming after you." "I will," Jamal promised solemnly. "That's the whole point, isn't it? Making sure the path gets wider, not narrower." Across the room, Diana Washington watched this exchange with pride. The past few months had been challenging for their family. Marcus's new role had required significant travel and long hours, and the public attention had brought both support and criticism. There had been hate mail alongside the appreciation, threats alongside the endorsements. But watching her husband now, seeing the tangible impact of his work, Diana knew they had made the right choice in embracing this unexpected chapter in their lives. The Marcus she had fallen in love with decades ago, idealistic, determined, quietly revolutionary in his insistence on excellence, was now affecting change on a scale they had never imagined possible. Jennifer Chen appeared at Diana's side, offering a glass of champagne. "He's in his element, isn't he?" she observed, following Diana's gaze to where Marcus was now deep in conversation with a group of young aviation students. "He is," Diana agreed. "Though he still misses flying regularly, the cockpit will always be his first love." Jennifer smiled. "We've got him scheduled for a Chicago-Atlanta route next month, just to keep his hours up and his skills sharp." "He'll appreciate that," Diana said gratefully. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sophia Walker, the travel journalist whose viral post had helped catalyze the events of the past months. She had continued covering the story, providing thoughtful analysis of Transcontinental's initiatives and their potential impact on the broader industry. "Dr. Washington," Sophia greeted Diana warmly, "your husband is setting a new standard for how companies respond to incidents of bias. Other airlines are already announcing similar programs." Diana nodded. Marcus has always believed that excellence is the most powerful response to doubt or discrimination. He's applying that same principle at the systemic level now, not just excellence in flying, but excellence in creating institutional change. As the reception continued, Marcus finally made his way to Diana's side, the tension he had carried into the presentation now easing from his shoulders. "Well done, Captain," she said softly, using his title as a term of endearment as she often did in private moments. He smiled, taking her hand. "Couldn't have done it without your support." "Oh, I think you could have," she countered with a smile, "but I'm glad you didn't have to." They were interrupted by Victoria Hargrove, approaching with a distinguished-looking older man Marcus didn't recognize. "Captain Washington, Dr. Washington," Victoria said formally. "I'd like to introduce William Cartwright, CEO of National Airways. He's expressed interest in implementing similar initiatives across their operations and hoped to speak with you about your approach." The introduction marked yet another expansion of the impact radiating from that morning at Gate 14, from a personal indignity to a company-wide initiative to an industry-wide movement. What might have remained a private humiliation or, at best, a momentary public outrage, had instead become a catalyst for structural change because of how Marcus had chosen to respond. With dignity, strategic thinking, and an insistence on addressing root causes rather than mere symptoms. As Marcus engaged with William Cartwright, explaining the core principles of the Elevate initiative, he caught sight of Reverend Jackson, the elderly civil rights activist from Flight 1372, now serving as a spiritual advisor to the Diversity Council. The older man gave him a subtle nod of approval, one generation of change-makers acknowledging another, the baton of progress being passed forward. The path from that gate counter to this moment had not been linear or easy. There had been resistance, setbacks, and compromises along the way. Corporate systems did not transform overnight, and individual biases did not dissolve with a single training session. The work was ongoing, imperfect, and sometimes frustratingly slow. But standing in that room, surrounded by the tangible evidence of progress, the scholarship recipients, the new training protocols, the policy changes, the industry attention, Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction that transcended the personal vindication of that morning at Gate 14. What had begun with 5 dismissive words, "This doesn't look right," had evolved into something profound. A reimagining of what was possible when institutions confronted their biases directly and committed to genuine transformation rather than defensive denial. And for Captain Marcus Washington, whose life had been defined by navigating both the open skies and the closed minds he sometimes encountered on the ground, this journey of institutional change had become perhaps his most important flight path, one that would create clearer skies for generations of pilots yet to come. Diana squeezed his hand, sensing his thoughts. "Good flight, Captain," she whispered. Marcus smiled, recognizing her use of pilot terminology for a successfully completed journey. "Good flight indeed," he agreed, knowing that while this particular milestone had been reached, the broader journey toward true equity in aviation and beyond continued. And he, along with all those who had been touched by the events of that fateful morning at Gate 14, would remain on board for whatever turbulence and blue skies lay ahead.